Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming out this morning. Also a thanks to the organizing committee for choosing this talk, and also for putting on a great conference so far. I know that they're running on low quantities of sleep and high quantities of coffee, so thanks to them. So the title of my talk is indeed Playing Nice with Django and React. A brief bit about who I am. My name is Jacob Cook. I'm a software engineer and project manager at Savoir-Faire Linux here in Montreal. And for those of you who don't speak French, that means that we do awesome stuff with Linux. At Savoir-Faire Linux, I tend to do some evangelism for Python and on the inside of the company, but also for JavaScript. So making sure that we can better form developers on cool ways of using Python, but also trying to win land for the use of JavaScript, both on the back end and on the front end whenever able. So a brief overview of this talk. I'm going to first talk about why I think it's important that people understand how front-end frameworks like React work, especially for back-end developers who might not have any experience working on the front end yet. Some of the concepts behind the differences between Django and React, and why it's not always easy to make them work together, at least not immediately. Some of the challenges that we find in making them work together, and then the solutions that we can look at to see how we create a functional Django application that's not necessarily just an API serving to a JavaScript system. So we will start out with why I think it's important. I think the use of Python and the use of JavaScript is very important for people to know how to use both. Oftentimes backend developers kind of have a negative view of front-end development, especially with modern JavaScript. I mean, modern JavaScript doesn't necessarily make it easy because it moves at such a quick pace. There's always new things coming out, new build tools, Grunt, Webpack, this and that, and it's really hard to keep up. And when we're talking about back-end development, things typically tend to evolve at a slower pace, or at least a more steady pace. So, I mean, we've had Django for quite a while now, and new releases come out, but it's not like we have to add 100,000 different modules or components to make it work in even a minimally functional way. It works out of the box. So that can kind of be frustrating for people who aren't used to dealing with that in the ecosystem of their development. But my personal opinion is that recent things in JavaScript should be really exciting for backend developers and people who are used to the kinds of syntax that Python offers. For example, things like ECMAScript 2015 ES6, it has a whole lot of new features that are really cool and kind of Pythonic. It adds generators, adds unpacking, things of that nature that make it much more easy for somebody to go from Python to JavaScript. But the old mentality persists. JavaScript tends to be something that we kind of look at like the ancient aliens guy. Like, you don't really know what you put into it, and you can't really be sure always of what you're going to get out from it. The asynchronous nature of it kind of plays into that a little bit. So it's not always well understood. Oftentimes, if you're a backend person that's done a little bit of work on the front end before, you're very familiar with jQuery. And that's going to be the brunt of what you use when you're marking up a simple page that just needs to have some kind of basic form validation, what have you. The alternate title for this talk was Getting Rid of jQuery for Fun and Profit. I personally don't see a lot of problems with jQuery, especially because it allows you to do things very quickly in manipulating the interface of the DOM of the browser. But it's becoming less and less necessary now that we have this proliferation of all of these other frameworks that allow us to do things in a more structured way. Another reason why I feel it's good for backend developers to learn more JavaScript and to learn things like React is because I'm a big proponent of the idea of full stack developers. So depending on your optimism level, I'm an internal optimist, so this is the viewpoint that I subscribe to. A full stack, as it's found in the Oxford Living Dictionary, means the entirety of a computer system or application comprising both the front end and the back end. So if you're an optimistic person, this is your definition of full stack, being a full stack developer, somebody that can work on the front end and on the back end with fairly equal levels of proficiency. If you're a pessimistic person, you might define it like this, which I also found online. It's when your boss tells you, we want to hire you to work on all parts of the stack because we can't afford specialized engineers for the different technical stack pieces and feel it's better to start the stack being subpar instead of having expertise in each stack layer. That's not at all what I mean. So there's definitely an economic case for hiring more people who are more proficient on both sides, backend and frontend. But that's not necessarily what I'm referring to here. It's somebody that understands the principles of backend development that can carry those over to frontend, and somebody that knows about the interface and can carry that knowledge over to the backend. That kind of knowledge is going to be very important when you're designing things like views, templates, API endpoints, because without that knowledge, you have one person that just does the backend stuff, and then you have the designer or the front-end team or what have you. Those things don't always mesh very easily. Each person has their own set of priorities, and it's not always easy to understand them. So sharing the knowledge between all parts of the application stack helps when somebody understands how all parts of the application stack work. You might not be able to read this very well, but the popularity of the term full stack is only going up. Different points along the timeline. React came out in, I think, February or March of 2013. And then Vue.js, which is also very popular today, came out shortly after. React Native, etc. And one of the impediments to learning React, and why I think it's important that people become more familiar with it, is that it introduces a lot of new terms that are completely foreign. Maybe not completely foreign, but that are quite new and different to the realm of both front-end development, typically when we're talking about jQuery, and for backend. So we have components, JSX. What is a JSX file? Why is there HTML markup in my JavaScript? That's weird. Props, state, having to transpile between different versions of JavaScript support. So all of this just adds an extra layer of complexity. And it's important that that complexity is understood, at least at a rudimentary level, so that we can better work with our front-end teams. Bottom line, I think JavaScript is really important, especially for Python developers, whether we think it should be or not. So much of the modern web now is heavily dependent on JavaScript. Sometimes it's done very well. Sometimes you have an application that's only a few kilobytes large that loads in your browser and it does some really good optimization. But other times it's kind of a good thing. So you have an application that's 3 or 4 megabytes large and that loads in your browser and it takes a long time and it makes everything slow. People oftentimes use that kind of as a scapegoat for saying, no, I don't want to learn JavaScript. It's stupid. Just do everything on the back end that you can. Use jQuery. That's all you need. But as I kind of alluded to before, I think JavaScript is cool. Lots of features in ES6, for example, that Python people should love. It introduces classes instead of having to manually work with prototypes of all of your functions. It includes things like destructuring, improved object literals, module imports, and generators, which I think is really cool. And especially goes more into the realm of asynchronous development. So a brief overview of some of the concepts that we're working with. And because it is almost noon on a Sunday, and I'm sure some of your blood sugar is kind of getting a little bit low, I'm going to ask you to do some calisthenics with me. So how many people here are familiar with or have used Django? That's about what I thought it would be. Yeah, pretty much everybody. What about React? Okay, that's probably more than I thought it would be. That's great. Okay. So if you've heard anything about Django, you know that Django is the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. It's a very powerful framework. It's intuitive, it's fast, it's easy to get started with. It's not the only horse in the race of Python web frameworks, but it's the one that nearly everybody knows and a lot of people use and are really happy with. The flexibility of its database query set API, you all know all of that already. So React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It introduces 3 main concepts into the realm of development on the front end. It uses props, states, and components. So props are the items that are loaded when you're initially creating your component. So you can think of it as kind of the input data or the model that you're passing to your component to start with. The state is the thing that can be modified from within. So when you're clicking on a button and you want to change a value, you can set the state and change that and have it initially instantly returned in the render of your component. And well, components are individual elements of a page that can be composed next to each other, but also in a nesting fashion. So if we're talking about the layout of a web page, you have a whole page can be a component that has individual components nested underneath it for your form, and then in another level for your inputs, for your submit buttons. All of this can be made with different components in React. And the idea is really to have a singular component that you can reuse in multiple locations and in multiple situations. So it really follows the ubiquity of a Python function. A Python function allows you to write an operation that you're going to reuse in multiple places and have it execute in the same fashion. Well, components allow you to do the same thing in React. Just because I'm talking mostly about Django and React today, by the way, doesn't mean that the principles that we're going to look at are different for other frameworks. So if you prefer to use Flask or Vue.js or Django and Vue.js or Flask and React or whatever, a lot of these concepts are still going to apply. So a brief explanation about what the Django approach is to rendering a web page. It's a bit more complicated than this, but permit me to do a vulgarization here for you. You have a request that leaves the user's browser for a website X. That request goes to the URL handler of Django. It is routed to a specific view function or class. The view function or class takes on the task of querying for the database model. The database model takes all of the information necessary to properly fulfill the request for the page and passes it back to the view. The view then takes the information that it gained from the model, does any kind of modifications that it feels it needs to do, and passes that to the template. The template is the layout in HTML, but also with properly formatted values for where to put everything that we got from the model or from other elements of the context of the page. Template here could be interchangeable for something like a Django REST framework serializer. We're just rendering to JSON in that case instead of an HTML template. We pass it back to the view, and then the view sends it back to the user. So pretty simple stuff. The React approach is a bit different because most uses of React these days, this is a debatable question, which is why I put the star there. Most of the uses of React these days are done with the optic of making it into a single page app. So the idea behind a single page app is that you have the entire logic of interacting with the web page is done in the JavaScript and separated from the backend, connected by an API. All of the logic of obtaining the model, doing any kind of saving to the database, that whole thing is abstracted by the API and it's done asynchronously behind the scenes rather than clicking a button, loading a new page, and having that request be sent synchronously through HTTP to the backend. So a diagram of this kind of superimposed on what we just saw with Django. The request goes to the view of Django, but the request is done with Ajax, so it's done in the background asynchronously. The same exact interaction between the view and the model occurs. We obtain the data from the model, we pass it back to the view, and it goes to the user's browser. However, there's an extra level here, just because the JavaScript in the browser is what manages the template. It renders the template, renders all of the components, and it does that continuously based on all of the information that it is obtaining in the background from the API, and also any input that the user offers. So that cycle is all handled between the user's computer and the template in JavaScript, the virtual DOM, and any other information is obtained asynchronously by the API. So you can see how these two models between React and Django are kind of different. Django really wants to, at least when you're using it vanilla, it really wants to have a multi-page app structure where every single action that you perform, it creates a new template for you and it serves it back to the browser. And that's not necessarily wildly different from similar frameworks to Django, like we can see in Ruby or Express.js, etc. But the challenge is going to be, where do we draw the lines between the type of work that we want Django to do and the type of work that we want React to do? I think that the challenge is in trying to make both of them work is 50% human and 50% framework, because of all of the things that I've mentioned before regarding why JavaScript is kind of opaque for backend developers sometimes, and 50% because the two things were not really developed with either one in mind. So this creates a lot of mystery, and the mystery is something that we have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out. So the primary issue is, like I said, getting the fact that Django wants to do as much templating as possible. Where do you draw the line? How do you include the JavaScript files in your template? Do you include one specific file with the libraries that you need for each page that you want to load, for each view, and you have just the individual components in the view that you want to composite there in front of you? Or do you have one large file that contains all of the JavaScript for your entire application? But in that case, how do you break it down into different components, different pages? You don't really want to load the whole thing if you're just working on a specific subset of your application. So it's a big mystery. And this mystery oftentimes has a culprit, which is called Webpack. How many of you are familiar with Webpack? Okay. How many of you know a lot about Webpack and know how to use it very well? That's about what I expected, yeah. So Webpack is it's an asset bundler. It's a module transpiler. It has a plugin architecture. But the problem with Webpack is that it's not always the simplest thing to understand. It's made a lot of improvements over the years, over the months. I don't quite remember when Webpack was initially created, but the idea behind it is simply that you have all of the individual files in whatever format you choose. You're going to include that into a Webpack configuration. Webpack is going to take a destination directory, and it's going to say, okay, based on the input that you give me in the config, I'm going to write XXX file there and include all of the images, include all of the CSS in the place that needs to be, voila. So the end result is kind of magical because it looks up all of the information that you put in this small config file, and then it creates your entire source tree for your front-end application for you. And it handles things like transpiling. So if you're using the latest versions of JavaScript, those might include features that are not necessarily available in the versions of your browser that you can use, especially if users are using older versions of the browser, Internet Explorer. So things like Webpack can become very useful for this, but like I said, it's difficult to understand. It adds a lot of mystery to something that's already not very straightforward for somebody that's just starting out. So, possible solutions. You can be a purist and you can use just the Django framework or just the React way, and you can create an API very simply in Django REST framework, for example, that interacts with your React application. But I'm a real big proponent of the 80-20 rule. And my belief is that if 80% of your application can be done well with Django, there's no real reason why you should redo the whole thing just to put it in a single page app, just because it's the cool or the trendy thing to do. If only 20% of your application requires the dynamicity that, is that a word? The dynamicness that React can afford you, then it's only 20% and you make do with that 20% and you try and make it work within the Django flow. So the proposition that I have here, the way to make React work with Django, is called just enough JavaScript, I guess. And the idea behind just enough JavaScript is it does what it says on the tin. It includes just enough of the React way of doing things to make it work super well with Django. You start out with creating a Webpack configuration because that's an unavoidable part of this whole thing. If you're using React, there are ways not to use JSX, but I probably wouldn't advise it. So you're going to have to use Webpack, but we can create a standard config in Webpack that's not very complicated, not very detailed, but still does everything we need it to do. we can, for each individual page, each individual view that we're going to render, we're going to pack the information that we glean from the model or the context that we want to render on the page, and we can put it aside for React to pick up later. For each page, a component. So you have a parent component in React that controls the arborescence of every single component that you find underneath it, and the rest is awesome. So this is what the model looks like if you're combining the two. So you're starting out with the exact same outline that the Django model affords you. So you go to the view, you get your information from the model, blah, blah, blah. You go back to the template, you fill out the template with whatever information you need, you send it back to the user, great. But you're still able to keep the functionality of recreating the DOM via React's virtual DOM whenever you need to make a change. So if you're adding form validation, you're adding just a couple of AJAX endpoints on an API, but you don't necessarily want to extend that to the way that the pages load initially. These are all good candidates for the use of this kind of approach. And it allows us to use things that we already know and love from Django, like the forms, Django forms. You can have a form set and then just have the dynamic components of React on the side or interact with those forms as necessary. A really good way to retrofit an existing application. So this is the tree of what we want to accomplish. We start out with something that's, again, pretty similar to what Django affords us. We have our models file, our views file, our admin file, etc. A folder for our components. So that's where we put all of the JSX files that are going to be used to composite our application and compose them together. We have the assets. So the index.js is going to be the entry point, and that's what we're going to tell Webpack to look at and look for all of the individual components that are then imported into that entry point for use later. But we keep our Django templates and we keep our models and views. So the Webpack config, I don't have several hours, so I can't explain to you the entire inner workings of Webpack, but in essence, you're going to be working with three primary elements here. You have the entry point, the output directory, and the module loaders. So the entry point is just a path to the index.js file, which is what we're going to be importing all of our source files from. You can kind of think of that as like the dunder init file in a Python module. Oftentimes you just use that to prepare some things, to import some other modules as necessary, and that's going to be exactly the same thing as this index.js file. You specify your output directory. So you go to assets and bundles, and that's where the transpiled, compiled module magic happens. That's where Webpack puts all its stuff when it's done. And then you have the module loaders. So you need to configure Webpack to test for JSX files, because otherwise it might not necessarily know what type of framework you're working with. And then you pass it to a tool that's called Babel. And Babel is what handles the transpiling from ES6 to older versions of JavaScript, or JavaScript that's going to be compatible with things like browsers. And once you've installed all of this using npm or yarn install Webpack, npm install Webpack, you can go into your node modules directory and execute the Webpack command line interface. You specify the path for the Webpack config, and then you add a little option there called watch. That means it's going to run in the background, and anytime it detects a change in any one of your source files, it should automatically recompile everything so that you can go to the browser and see your changes after a refresh. And that last command to work with Webpack works well with a Django extension called Webpack Loader. Webpack Loader allows you to manage a lot of the things that Webpack does automatically and integrate those into your templates in Django. So for example, Webpack will add a pseudo-random string at the end of the source files that it creates, just to make sure that every single time it reruns its cycle, a new file is generated so that the browser's not going to cache that when it comes up. But since you're adding random data to the name of one of your paths, you can't just hard code that into your application. That it wouldn't make any sense after the next time you change your JavaScript file. So this kind of library handles those things pretty transparently. Some other elements in this code snippet that you might find useful, I hope everyone can see that, is that we're adding an extra script tag there that is going to contain some of the information that comes directly from Django when it goes through its view template interaction. So we're going to specify the component that should be used by React, so the exact module that's going to be looked up in our Webpack structure, and also any data that we want to pass to it. So we can render as JSON the model that we're loading from the database, for example, and put it there, and then React can go and find it later. A views.py file here. We are loading the context into the context of the template, the initial template that we're going to render, the name of the component, and the data, just getting the query sets as it's specified in whatever subclass that we're working with. So here the idea is that we're creating a simple little form that's going to be able to generate insults from Monty Python movies for us. And the only thing that we really need to do at this point is just use a standard Django list view with a model and specify the name of the React component that we're going to be working with. And this is the entry point in the index.js file that Webpack is going to be using as the primary place that it puts everything together. So here we just do a list of all of the components that we've created for our application, and we import them using ES6 syntax here. We create a dictionary with, or a JavaScript object with the names of our components and links to all of the component classes that we're going to create and use. And then we have a snippet there that tells React, okay, grab the component that's necessary for this page and put it in the div ID React in the template that's being rendered. And the last piece of the puzzle here is an add file. So here is the component for adding a new insult to the list of things that have been delivered. So, for example, we start with an extension of the React component called add component. Again, if you've never seen ES6 syntax, this is going to be pretty cool to see because you have your constructor method, which is very similar to a dunder init. You get the props, and what's contained in those props is what we passed along. There. Yeah, so when we designated React data, we passed the data from the model that was rendered in the template by the view, and we obtain it here. And then we can do whatever we want with it now in our React components. We do other things here also, like initializing the states, some magic to make sure that our action methods get the correct context. Another method that we add here to our class is handle click. So this is the first method handler that we're going to create. All that this does is each time the user clicks on a button, it's going to choose a random insult from the list, and it's going to increment a counter that we are also storing in the state to know that how many times the user has clicked the button. When we go to render the actual template with React, this is the JSX part. This is the part that includes actual HTML in the JavaScript that we're writing, but we can include the values that come directly from the JavaScript into our template. So here we ask, what is your quest? If there is an insult already prepared, we're going to put it into the template there, have the number of times the user's clicked on the button, and then each time the user clicks on the button, we make a reference to the onClick action, and that gets passed to the method that we created in the last step. And so the end result is something that looks like this. We start out with a very basic snippet from the page. What is your quest? I seek the grail. And then we get an insult back. So in creating the page in that way, we can have a model that is rendered with Django. And this is like a really, really simple application of this, right? It's kind of useless if you think about it, but it serves a purpose to show that you can have multiple pages in an application that have some dynamic elements and that can still work with the models that and the context that come directly from Django, and that we don't have to scrap everything and write a single page app that uses the API. So thank you very much.